A widowed black mom gives coffee to a lonely biker, never expecting what the Hell's Angel would do next. In a quiet Mississippi diner, a mother just trying to keep her lights on shows kindness to a stranger everyone else fears. But when the man leaves a $100 bill under his cup, the town starts talking, and her world begins to change. Soon, she learns he's not just a drifter. He's a man with scars deeper than his tattoos, carrying secrets that could destroy or save the little diner she's fighting to keep alive. As gossip spreads and old wounds reopen, her faith is tested in ways she never imagined. Because behind the leather and silence hides a past too heavy for one man to bear, and a redemption too big for one town to understand. When Grace comes wearing a biker's jacket, will the town reject it? Or will love finally break through the chains of judgment? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Mississippi morning dawned with a gloomy cast, heavy clouds hanging low over the small town like a thick wool blanket. Tanya Brooks stood at the entrance of the Blessing Cup diner, her keys jingling softly as she unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of yesterday's coffee and fresh cleaning supplies greeted her as she flipped on the lights, casting a warm glow against the gray day outside. "Darius, honey, make sure you get under those corner tables," she called out to her 15-year-old son, who was methodically pushing a mop across the checkered floor. His movements were careful, but showed hints of teenage reluctance. "I got it, Mom," he answered, his voice carrying that edge of exasperation that seemed to come with being 15. Still, he adjusted his technique, making sure to reach the spots she'd pointed out. By the window, 9-year-old Lena moved from table to table, her small hands wielding a cleaning cloth while she hummed "Amazing Grace" under her breath. The sound brought a smile to Tanya's face, even as her eyes caught sight of the stack of bills waiting on her office desk. How sweet the sound. Lena's clear voice lifted above the quiet morning sounds of the diner coming to life. The little girl's braids swayed as she worked, her movements matching the rhythm of her song. Tanya paused at the coffee maker, closing her eyes briefly. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the machine's gurgling. "We could use a little help today." The morning light caught the silver chain of her wedding ring, which she now wore around her neck, a constant reminder of the husband she'd lost and the strength she needed to carry on. The first drops of rain began to tap against the windows as the regular morning customers trickled in. Mrs. Henderson with her crossword puzzle, Mr. Peterson ordering his usual black coffee and wheat toast. The routine was familiar, comfortable, but the register remained disappointingly quiet. Thunder rolled across the sky like drums in a heavenly orchestra, and the rain intensified. The bell above the door chimed, but instead of the usual local faces, a large figure filled the doorframe. Water dripped from his leather vest, creating small puddles on the floor Darius had just cleaned. The Hell's Angels patch on his back seemed to glow ominously in the diner's fluorescent lighting. The usual morning chatter died instantly. Mrs. Henderson's fork clattered against her plate. Mr. Peterson's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened on the edges. Even Lena's humming stopped mid-verse. Tanya felt Darius move closer to her, his body tense with protective instinct. But she stepped forward, summoning a smile that came from years of practice in putting others at ease. "Welcome to the Blessing Cup," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Would you like some coffee? On the house. Looks like you could use something warm." The biker's eyes, partially hidden under wet strands of graying hair, fixed on her. He didn't speak, just gave a slight nod and moved to the counter, his heavy boots leaving wet prints on the floor. His hands, marked with old scars and faded tattoos, trembled slightly as he lowered himself onto a stool. Tanya poured him a cup of fresh coffee, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. She noticed how his fingers curled around the warm mug, holding it like something precious. The trembling in his hands seemed to ease slightly with each sip. The diner remained unusually quiet, the only sounds being the rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. When his cup was empty, Tanya approached with the coffee pot. As she refilled it, their eyes met properly for the first time. What she saw made her breath catch. Behind the weathered face and hard exterior, there was something raw and wounded in his gaze, like looking into the eyes of an injured animal that expected only more pain. It was gone in an instant, but it left an impression that settled deep in her heart. The biker finished his second cup in silence, then stood, reaching into his pocket. He placed some bills on the counter and headed for the door without a word. The bell chimed again as he left, disappearing into the storm as suddenly as he had arrived. Tanya walked over to clear his cup and stopped short. Under it lay $100 bill, deliberately placed and slightly weighted down by the empty cup. The gesture spoke louder than any words could have. That evening, long after closing time, Tanya knelt beside her children's beds as she did every night. Lena was already asleep, her face peaceful, one hand clutching the stuffed angel she'd had since she was a baby. In the next room, Darius pretended to be asleep, but she knew he was listening. He always did. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for reminding me today that there's always more to people than what we see." Her hand absently touched the wedding ring hanging from her neck as she thought about the mysterious biker. Something about his presence, about that moment when their eyes met, had stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time. A warm flutter of hope, like a small flame catching in her chest. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the blessing cup, something had shifted. Tanya couldn't explain it, but she felt like this gray morning had brought more than just a stranger seeking shelter from the storm. It had brought a reminder that sometimes hope arrives in the most unexpected packages, wearing a leather vest and carrying old wounds in need of healing. Lena stirred in her sleep, her lips moving in a silent continuation of her morning hymn. Tanya smoothed her daughter's hair and stood quietly, her heart full of questions about the stranger, but also filled with an inexplicable sense of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could bridge the deepest divides and touch the most guarded hearts. The next morning dawned clearer, though puddles still dotted the parking lot of the blessing cup. Tanya arrived early as usual, her keys jingling in the pre-dawn quiet. As she walked around back to check the dumpsters, she stopped short, blinking in surprise. The old wooden fence that had been leaning precariously for months now stood straight and strong. Fresh nails gleamed in the weathered boards, and someone had even added support posts where the old ones had rotted. Not only that, but the scattered trash bags and boxes that usually littered the area were neatly stacked and organized. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, running her hand along the sturdy repair work. The wood was still slightly damp from the night's rain, but the craftsmanship was solid. Professional, even. Inside, as she fired up the coffee makers and began prepping for breakfast, her mind kept drifting to the mysterious repairs. She had her suspicions, but they seemed too far-fetched to voice. The morning rush had just settled when the distinctive rumble of a Harley cut through the usual diner chatter. Through the window, Tanya saw the same leather-clad figure from yesterday, his bike gleaming despite the cloudy skies. This time, he walked in with purpose, though his eyes still carried that guarded look. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice gravelly but gentle. Name's Mac Dalton. Some folks call me Bulldog." He shifted his weight, looking almost embarrassed. "Your fence was sagging. Couldn't leave it like that." At the nearby tables, several regulars exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse closer, while Mr. Peterson pointedly rustled his newspaper. But Tanya just smiled, already pulling out a fresh slice of her homemade apple pie. "Well, Mr. Dalton, seems I owe you my thanks and this piece of pie." She set it before him with a fork. "Would you like some coffee with that?" "Just coffee black," he replied, settling onto a counter stool. His eyes widened slightly at the pie. "Ma'am, you don't owe me anything. Was just something needed doing." Over the next few hours, as customers came and went, Tanya found herself drawn into conversation with Mac. He was quiet but attentive, asking thoughtful questions between long silences. When she mentioned losing her husband, James, 3 years ago to a roadside bomb in Afghanistan, Mac removed his cap in respect. "Marines?" he asked softly. "Yes," Tanya nodded, twisting her wedding ring that now hung on a chain around her neck. "1st Battalion, 7th Marines. James always said the Corps was his calling. He loved serving his country." Mac's weathered face softened. "Good man, then. The best kind. What about you, Mr. Dalton? What brings you through our town?" He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "Just a man trying to fix too many yesterdays," he finally said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. "Figure maybe if I can mend enough broken things today, might make up for some I broke before." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mike from the supply company. His face was apologetic but firm as he approached the counter. "Mrs. Brooks, about that delivery scheduled for tomorrow?" He glanced uncomfortable at Mac before continuing. "The boss says we can't extend any more credit. We'll need payment in full before we can unload." Tanya's heart sank. She'd been counting on that 2-week grace period the company usually allowed. "I understand, Mike. Let me check my books and see what I can do." Later, as she was totaling receipts in the back office, she heard Mike's truck pull up. To her surprise, she found the delivery already being unloaded, with Mike looking both confused and relieved. "Someone called in and paid the balance, Mrs. Brooks," he explained. "Said they were a friend." Through the office window, she caught sight of Mac quietly finishing his coffee at the counter, studiously avoiding her gaze. As evening approached and she began closing up, Tanya noticed Mac still sitting at the counter, watching the street through the window. Suddenly, he stood up, leaving a generous tip beside his empty cup. "Excuse me," he said, heading for the door. Through the window, Tanya watched as he approached old Mr. Jenkins, who was struggling with his walker at the crosswalk. With gentle efficiency, Mac helped the veteran across the street, waiting patiently as the old man told what was surely one of his war stories, judging by his animated gestures. Only after ensuring Mr. Jenkins was safely on his way did Mac return to his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, and he pulled away into the deepening dusk. Tanya stood at the window, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. For the first time since James died, she realized she felt something she'd almost forgotten: the warm comfort of feeling safe watching someone leave, rather than the familiar knot of worry that had become her constant companion. She touched the wedding ring at her throat, a small smile playing at her lips. "You always said angels come in all forms, James," she whispered. "I'm starting to think you were right." The diner was quiet now, save for the soft clink of cups as Lena helped clear the last tables, still humming her hymns. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting warm pools of light on the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a motorcycle faded into the night. 2 days after Mac's first visits to the Blessing Cup, the morning crowd buzzed with whispered conversations. Mrs. Thompson leaned across her table toward Mrs. Miller, her coffee growing cold as she gestured toward the empty corner booth where Mac had sat yesterday. "Did you hear? She's keeping company with a Hell's Angel," Mrs. Thompson whispered, though not quietly enough. "I saw him here 3 times this week." Tanya kept her head high as she refilled coffee cups, pretending not to hear. The whispers followed her like shadows across the diner floor. At the counter, Darius wiped down the surface with more force than necessary, his jaw tight. "Mom's new project," he muttered when Lena asked why the man with the motorcycle kept coming back. "She always thinks she can fix everybody." The bell above the door chimed, and conversations hushed as Mac stepped in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the freshly mopped floor. Without a word, he hung up his leather vest, revealing a faded gray work shirt underneath, and grabbed the mop from the corner. "Mr. Dalton, you don't have to—" Tanya started. "Floor's wet from the rain," he said simply, already cleaning up his own tracks. "Least I can do." Later that afternoon, while Tanya worked in the kitchen, she heard Lena's delighted giggle from the dining room. She peeked out to find her daughter seated beside Mac at his corner booth, watching intently as his scarred hands guided a small pocket knife through a piece of pine wood. "See here?" Mac was saying softly, his usual gruff tone gentled. "You got to follow the grain. Let the wood tell you where it wants to go." Slowly, the rough block began taking shape under his careful strokes. "It's an angel," Lena exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Just like in church." "That's right, little lady. My boy used to love watching me carve these." Mac's hands stilled for a moment, and something dark passed across his face. "He was about your brother's age when—" Tanya stepped closer, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. Mac looked up, meeting her eyes. "The road took him too early," he finished, his voice breaking. He set down the half-finished angel and stood abruptly, mumbling an excuse about checking the squeaky hinge on the back door. That evening, after the last customer had gone, Tanya found Reverend Wilson's wife, Martha, waiting in her car outside. When Tanya waved, Martha quickly looked away and drove off. The gesture stung more than Tanya wanted to admit. "Jesus ate with tax collectors," she reminded herself softly, though her hands trembled slightly as she counted out the day's receipts. The register drawer stuck slightly when she pulled it open. There, tucked beneath the tens, lay a crisp $100 bill she knew hadn't been there during her afternoon count. Beside it was a folded note written in careful block letters. "For the kids' shoes. Don't tell." Tanya sank into a chair, the note clutched in her hand. Through the window, the highway stretched dark and empty under the streetlights, like a river of shadows. The money would cover new shoes for both children. Darius had been wearing his old ones long past their time, and Lena's were getting tight. But what would people say? The whispers were already growing louder, spreading through their small town like wildfire. A widow taking money from a strange biker? Her reputation, carefully maintained through 3 years of grieving, could crumble in an instant. She looked at the wooden angel Mac had left on the counter, its wings still rough, but its form emerging from the pine with surprising grace. Somewhere out there was a father who'd lost his son, trying to carve something beautiful out of his pain. Lena's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was finishing her homework. "Mom, can Mr. Mac teach me to make angels too? He says everybody's got light inside them, even if they look scary on the outside." Tanya touched the $100 bill, feeling the weight of both judgment and grace pressing down on her shoulders. The highway continued its silent vigil outside, offering no answers to her unspoken questions. In the empty diner, the wooden angel caught the last light of day, its unfinished wings reaching toward heaven while its feet remained firmly planted in the grain of the wood. Much like its maker, Tanya thought, caught between a dark past and the hope of redemption. Her fingers traced the simple note once more, and she found herself wondering what other wounds this man carried beneath his weathered exterior, and why God had sent him to her door on that rainy morning. The answers, like the dark highway outside, stretched far beyond what she could see. The rest of the evening passed in quiet routine, wiping down tables, checking the coffee makers, making sure everything was ready for tomorrow's breakfast crowd. But her mind kept returning to the $100 bill in the register, to the unfinished wooden angel, and to the broken man who'd carved it. Outside, the spring night settled over the small town like a prayer, while inside the blessing cup, a widow stood at her window, balanced between gratitude and fear, watching the dark highway that had brought this strange angel to her door. "Lord," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass, "give me wisdom." The highway offered no reply, but somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle's engine echoed like distant thunder, then faded into silence. The wooden angel sat on the counter, its incomplete form a reminder that sometimes the most precious gifts come from the most unexpected sources, and that grace, like the grain in pine wood, follows its own path. If only we have the courage to follow where it leads. The weekend arrived with an angry growl of thunder that shook the windows of the blessing cup. Dark clouds rolled across the Mississippi sky like waves of smoke, and the wind picked up enough force to bend the young trees along Main Street nearly double. Tanya watched the sky darken from behind the diner's counter, her hands wrapped around a fresh pot of coffee. The weather station had warned about severe thunderstorms, but this looked worse than expected. Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that made the dishes rattle. "Mama, the power's flickering," Lena called from where she sat, doing homework at her usual booth. As if on cue, the lights dimmed, brightened, then went out completely. The diner fell into an eerie gray twilight, broken only by the storm's electric flashes through the windows. Outside, the rain began to fall in sheets, drumming against the roof like countless tiny hammers. "Everybody stay calm," Tanya called out to the handful of customers. "We've got emergency lights in the back." Before she could move, the bell above the door chimed. Mac's massive frame filled the doorway, rain dripping from his leather vest. Behind him, his pickup truck sat loaded with firewood, tarped against the deluge. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting down a box filled with flashlights and candles. "Storm knocked out power 3 blocks over. More's coming." Tanya felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Mac. The door chimed again as a young couple burst in, soaked to the bone. "Our car stalled," the woman explained, clutching her purse. "The streets are starting to flood." Over the next hour, more people sought refuge in the diner. Families with children, elderly couples, travelers caught between destinations, the booths and counter filled with wet, worried faces, illuminated by candlelight and battery-powered lanterns. Mac moved with quiet efficiency, bringing in firewood for the old potbelly stove in the corner that hadn't seen use in years. The warmth slowly spread through the diner as Tanya pulled out every pot she had and started making huge batches of her mother's chili recipe. "Got some supplies in the truck," Mac said softly. "Extra bread, canned goods. Heard the forecast last night." Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Tanya felt something warm unfurl in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. The storm raged outside, but inside the blessing cup, a different kind of atmosphere developed. Strangers shared tables and stories. Children played cards by flashlight. Mac kept the stove stoked and helped serve bowls of steaming chili, while Tanya made endless pots of coffee on the gas range. A small commotion arose near the door. A little girl, no more than 3 years old, had gotten separated from her mother in the crowd and began to cry. Before anyone could react, Mac knelt down beside her, his weathered face softening. "Hey there, little miss," he said gently. "Let's find your mama, okay?" The girl looked up at him, tears still rolling down her cheeks, but her sobs quieting. Mac lifted her carefully onto his shoulders, giving her a better view of the room. "Can you see her from up there?" "Mommy!" the girl called out, pointing toward the back booth. A worried-looking woman jumped up, relief flooding her face. Reverend Wilson, who had come in an hour earlier looking decidedly uncomfortable about sharing space with the former Hell's Angel, watched the scene unfold. When Mac handed the little girl back to her mother, the preacher's stern expression softened slightly. As the evening wore on, the diner took on an almost sacred quality. Candles flickered like prayer lights, conversations hummed like hymns, and the smell of warm food filled the air like incense. People who normally wouldn't speak to each other found themselves sharing stories and breaking bread together. Tanya moved through it all like a conductor, orchestrating this impromptu symphony of humanity. She caught glimpses of Mac throughout the evening, helping an elderly man to the restroom, entertaining children with simple magic tricks using spoons and napkins, quietly refilling coffee cups before they were empty. Near midnight, the storm finally began to ease. The power flickered back on, drawing cheers from the crowd. As people began to leave, many pressed money into Tanya's hands despite her protests. Reverend Wilson paused at the door, looking back at her with what might have been a smile. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly, then disappeared into the drizzling night. The next morning, Mac's familiar motorcycle was absent from its usual spot. Tanya told herself she wasn't watching for it, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The second day passed the same way, the diner feeling strangely empty despite its regular customers. On the third morning, the roar of his Harley broke the dawn quiet. Tanya's heart lifted, then plummeted when she saw him limping through the door. A dark bruise shadowed his jaw, and he held himself carefully, like a man trying not to show pain. "Mac, what happened?" She hurried around the counter, leading him to a seat in the empty diner. He accepted a cup of coffee with a grimace. "Some old friends paid me a visit, had some words about me getting soft." His laugh was bitter. "Guess they didn't appreciate seeing pictures of me serving chili in a diner." Tanya's hands shook as she retrieved the first aid kit from under the counter. "These friends from your old life?" Mac nodded, wincing as she began cleaning a cut above his eye. "Cal and Reaper. They've got long memories and short tempers." Their hands brushed as she applied antiseptic, and neither pulled away immediately. Something electric passed between them, different from any tension before. Suddenly, absurdly, Mac chuckled. "What's funny?" Tanya asked, her own lips curving upward despite her concern. "Just thinking, 20 years riding with the roughest crew in 3 states, and here I am, getting patched up by an angel in an apron." Tanya's laugh bubbled up unexpected and real, joining his. For a moment, they were just two people sharing a genuine moment of joy in the early morning light. The moment shattered when the mail slot clinked. Tanya went to retrieve the envelope, her good mood evaporating as she read the official notice inside. Her legs went weak, and she sank into a nearby chair. "Tanya?" Mac's voice seemed to come from far away. "What is it?" She held out the foreclosure notice with trembling hands. All the late payments, all the struggling to keep up with rising costs, it had finally caught up with her. The bank was giving her 30 days. Mac read the notice, his face darkening. "Let me help," he said simply. Tanya looked up at him, seeing the earnest concern in his eyes. But beyond him, through the window, she could see Mrs. Peterson walking past, already whispering to her friend and pointing at Mac's motorcycle. The town's judgment hung over them like storm clouds gathering once again. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with dew sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Tanya arrived early to open the diner, her heart still heavy from the foreclosure notice. As she turned the corner, she stopped short. A small crowd had gathered in the parking lot, and at its center stood Mac, unloading tools from the bed of an old pickup truck. Paint cans, brushes, sanders, and lumber filled the truck bed. Mac wore faded jeans and a work shirt instead of his usual leather vest, looking more like a contractor than a former biker. He glanced up as she approached, offering a tentative smile. "What's all this?" Tanya asked, keys jingling in her hand. "Figure if we make the place shine, maybe the bank'll think twice about that 30-day notice," Mac said, hefting a toolbox. "Sometimes folks just need to see potential to believe in something." Tanya shook her head, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I can't accept this. People are already talking, and if they see you—" "Let them talk," Mac interrupted gently. "You gave me coffee when nobody else would look me in the eye. Now let me build something good here." She looked around at the gathered crowd. Among them, she recognized old Mr. Jenkins, a Korean War veteran who came in every Tuesday for meatloaf. He stood quietly with two other elderly veterans, all wearing their service caps. "We thought we might lend a hand too," Mr. Jenkins said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Been watching this young man fix things around here for weeks. Figured it's about time we pitched in." Tanya's eyes welled up, but she blinked back the tears. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Mac replied, already measuring the sagging porch steps. "Just keep the coffee coming." The morning unfolded like a well-orchestrated dance. Mac directed the work with quiet efficiency, assigning tasks based on each person's abilities. The veterans tackled the porch repairs, their old hands still skilled with hammer and saw. Two of their wives showed up with sandwiches and lemonade, setting up an impromptu refreshment station. Tanya kept the diner running while watching the transformation outside. The worn boards of the porch were replaced with fresh lumber. Peeling paint was scraped away, revealing the building's bones. Even the ancient sign, its letters long faded, was carefully lowered for repainting. Around noon, she spotted Darius watching from inside, his expression a mix of curiosity and lingering suspicion. He'd been avoiding Mac since the man first started coming around, but now she caught him studying the biker's precise movements as he demonstrated proper sanding technique to one of the veterans. "You know anything about paint mixing, son?" Mac called out, not looking up from his work. Darius, startled, then tried to pretend he hadn't been watching. "Some," he muttered. "Learned a bit in shop class." "Could use an extra hand getting these colors right for the sign," Mac said casually. "If you're not too busy." Tanya held her breath, watching the internal struggle play across her son's face. Finally, Darius stepped outside, maintaining a careful distance as he approached the paint cans. The afternoon wore on, the sun baking the fresh paint and new wood. The crowd thinned as the veterans tired, but Mac kept working, his movements methodical and purposeful. Tanya noticed he favored his left side slightly, probably still sore from his encounter with his former gang members. As evening approached, she closed the diner early and prepared a special dinner. The smell of fried chicken and peach cobbler drifted through the screen door, drawing appreciative looks from the few remaining workers. She carried 2 loaded plates outside, where Mac was putting final touches on the sign's lettering. "Time to take a break," she announced. They sat on the new porch steps, plates balanced on their knees. Tanya had shed her apron hours ago, and her clothes bore scattered paint marks. Mac's shirt was no better, streaked with multiple colors and sawdust. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked softly, watching him savor a bite of cobbler. Mac was quiet for a long moment. "Because sometimes a man needs to build something instead of tearing it down. Spent too many years being the one people feared. Figure it's time to be the one they can count on instead." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Tanya, surprising them both. "You've got paint in your beard," she explained, gesturing with her fork. Mac rubbed his chin, succeeding only in adding more paint, which made them both laugh harder. The sound drew Darius to the doorway, where he stood watching them with an unreadable expression. Later that night, after the tools were packed away and the last worker had gone home, Tanya knelt beside her bed. The familiar posture of prayer came naturally, but the words were different this time. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm not asking for rescue anymore. Just give me the strength to believe that people can change, to trust that sometimes angels wear leather instead of wings, and redemption comes with a paintbrush instead of a sermon." Through her window, she could see the diner's fresh paint gleaming in the moonlight. Tomorrow there would be more work, more gossip, more challenges. But tonight, she let herself believe in the possibility of transformation, not just for her diner, but for all the wounded souls who found their way to its door. The foreclosure notice still sat on her bedside table, but it seemed less threatening now. Something was building here, brick by brick, brushstroke by brushstroke, something that went beyond mere business or building repairs. In the quiet of her room, Tanya finally understood that sometimes faith looked like a former Hell's Angel with paint in his beard, showing up early to build something beautiful out of broken things. The renovated diner gleamed in the Sunday morning light. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and new curtains hung in the windows. Tanya stood in the doorway, taking in the transformation. The worn-out booths had been reupholstered, their cracked vinyl replaced with warm brown leather. Even the old ceiling fans spun without their usual rattle, thanks to Mac's patient repairs. "You sure about this?" Mac asked from behind her, his voice rough with concern. He'd traded his leather vest for a clean white shirt that looked stiff and uncomfortable on his broad frame. "Free meals for veterans and widows every Sunday," Tanya confirmed, smoothing her apron. "The Lord provides for us. Time we do some providing ourselves." The first community supper was set to begin at 5 o'clock. By 4:30, cars started pulling into the parking lot. Tanya recognized Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had died in Vietnam 40 years ago. Then came old Mr. Peterson, still wearing his Korean War veteran's cap. They entered cautiously, as if unsure of their welcome. Darius worked the door, showing people to their seats while Lena bounced between tables with water pitchers. The girl had taken to calling these gatherings "Jesus's party," making Tanya smile every time she heard it. At 4:45, Reverend Matthews arrived with his wife. Their presence sent a ripple through the growing crowd. The preacher had been one of the most vocal critics of Mac's presence in town. He chose a seat near the door, his expression carefully neutral. Mac stayed in the kitchen, helping plate the food: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, and fresh rolls. His hands were steady as he worked, but Tanya noticed how he kept glancing through the service window at the gathering crowd. "Almost time," she said softly, touching his arm. "Would you say the blessing?" His head snapped up. "Me? But the preacher—" "This is your idea too. Please?" At 5 o'clock sharp, the diner was full. The mix of people was unlike anything the town had seen before. Elderly widows sat beside gruff veterans. Young families squeezed in next to weathered bikers who'd heard about the free meal through Mac's connections. Mac stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. The room gradually fell silent as he cleared his throat. His eyes darted to Tanya, who nodded encouragingly. "Lord," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "You pulled me out of the ditch. Help me serve somebody before I fall back in." The silence held for a heartbeat. Then someone started clapping. The applause spread like wildfire through the room, bringing tears to Tanya's eyes. Even Reverend Matthews joined in, his stern face softening. The meal that followed felt like a miracle. Stories flowed as freely as the sweet tea. Mrs. Henderson shared photos of her grandchildren with a Vietnam vet who'd been eating alone at the truck stop for 20 years. Mr. Peterson found himself in an animated discussion about military aircraft with one of Mac's biker friends who'd served in Desert Storm. Tanya moved between tables, refilling plates and listening to snippets of conversation. She caught sight of Mac showing Lena how to balance 3 plates at once, his patient instruction making the girl giggle. The evening seemed perfect until she went to take out the trash. The words hit her like a physical blow. Devil's Kitchen sprawled across the back wall in angry red spray paint. The letters dripped like blood in the dim light. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a bucket and brush. The brick surface scraped her knuckles raw as she scrubbed, but the paint barely faded. Tears of frustration blurred her vision. "Let me help." Mac's voice came quietly from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. Together they worked in silence, the brush passing between them. The paint slowly gave way to their combined efforts, but Tanya could still see its ghost on the wall, and in Mac's eyes. Later, after the last guest had gone and Darius had taken Lena home, Tanya found Mac sitting on the back steps. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he watched through the window where a few neighborhood kids were helping clean up, laughing as they stacked chairs. She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching. The cricket song filled the space between them. "I used to run with a gang," he said finally, his voice thick. "We didn't just fight and steal. We sold poison, drugs that killed kids just like them in there." He gestured toward the window. "Mothers lost their babies because of what we did, and now here I am, trying to feed people, like that makes up for it." "The past is the past," Tanya said gently. Mac flinched at her words, turning away. "Don't. Please don't forgive me so easy. I don't deserve it." "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," she replied, thinking of all the times she'd struggled to forgive herself for not being able to save her husband. "It's about choosing to see who someone is trying to become instead of who they used to be." The crickets sang on as they sat there, 2 broken people watching children laugh in a diner that had become something more than just a place to eat. The ghost of the graffiti lingered on the wall behind them, but its power seemed to fade with each moment of grace. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Blessing Cups parking lot as Mac knelt beside his Harley, pointing out parts to Darius. The teenager stood with his arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed despite the curiosity in his eyes. "See this carburetor?" Mac's weathered hands traced the metal component. "It's the heart of the fuel system, just like your mama's kitchen is the heart of her diner." Darius shifted his weight, fighting a smile. "Whatever. I know about engines already." "That so?" Mac raised an eyebrow, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. "Tell me how you diagnose a rough idle, then." The boy's confidence faltered. Well, you'd check the, No shame in not knowing," Mac said quietly. "Everyone starts somewhere. Your daddy was a Marine. Bet he had to learn everything from scratch, too." The mention of his father made Darius stiffen. "How'd you know about my dad?" "Your mama told me. Said he was a good man. Strong. Brave." Mac paused, meeting Darius's eyes. "Like his son." Before Darius could respond, a group of teenage boys walked past the diner, snickering. One called out, "Hey, Brooks, your mom's biker boyfriend teaching you to be a criminal too?" Darius's fists clenched. His face burned with shame and anger. "Let it go," Mac said firmly. "Their words can't hurt you unless you let them." "Easy for you to say," Darius spat. "You don't have to go to school with them. Everyone's talking about how you're probably just using my mom, how you're probably still in that gang." Mac was quiet for a long moment, studying the boy's face. Finally, he stood up. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." "Where?" "Just outside town. My workshop. If your mama says it's okay." Inside the diner, Tanya was wiping down tables. She looked up as they entered, her eyes moving between them questioningly. "Mrs. Brooks," Mac said formally, "I'd like to take Darius to see my workshop. Show him some proper mechanical work. It's about 15 minutes out near the old Miller farm." Tanya considered this, her dish towel pausing mid-wipe. "Darius, what do you think?" The boy shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Whatever. It's fine, I guess." "Be back before dark," she said finally. "And Darius, mind your manners." The ride out of town was silent except for the rumble of Mac's Harley. Darius sat, behind him, holding on, but keeping as much distance as possible. They turned down a dirt road bordered by towering pine trees, eventually stopping at a large metal shed. Mac pulled out a key ring and unlocked the heavy door. "Welcome to my sanctuary." Darius stepped inside and blinked, adjusting to the dim light. What he saw made him catch his breath. The workshop was unlike anything he'd expected. Tools hung in neat rows along the walls, gleaming in the light that filtered through dusty windows. But it was the other items that caught his attention. Handmade wooden crosses of various sizes were mounted between the tools, and old motorcycle helmets lined a shelf, each one painted with different designs. "You make these?" Darius asked, touching one of the crosses. "Yeah, helps me think. Helps me remember." "Remember what?" Mac walked to a workbench and picked up a framed photograph. He held it for a moment before passing it to Darius. The photo showed a teenage boy with Mac's eyes, sitting proudly on a dirt bike. He was grinning at the camera, his whole life ahead of him. "That's Eli," Mac said softly. "My son." Darius studied the picture. "Where is he now?" "Gone." Mac's voice was rough. 10 years ago, he was 15, just like you." He sat heavily on a wooden stool, his shoulders sagging. "I was running with a bad crowd back then, Hell's Angels. We'd gotten into it with another gang over territory. There was a chase. Eli was riding his bike home from school, got caught in the crossfire, went off the road trying to avoid them." Darius's throat felt tight. "It wasn't your fault, though, right?" "It was. All of it. I brought that darkness into his life, made him think that lifestyle was something to look up to." Mac gestured at the crosses. "Each one of these represents someone I've lost, someone I failed. Eli's is the biggest one." The workshop fell silent except for the sound of cicadas outside. Darius looked at the photo again, seeing it differently now. The boy's smile seemed sadder somehow. "That's why you helped my mom, isn't it?" he asked finally. "Because of him?" "Partly," Mac admitted, "but mostly because your mama showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. She saw past what I used to be." "And what are you now?" "Just a man trying to do better, trying to help somebody else's son have the chances mine didn't get." Darius set the photo down carefully. His earlier resentment felt smaller now, childish in the face of such raw pain. "Could you—" he hesitated. "Could you show me more about the carburetor?" Mac's eyes brightened slightly. "Sure, son. We can start right now if you want." They spent the next hour going over engine basics. Mac's patient explanations punctuated by Darius's increasingly eager questions. The sun was setting when they finally headed back to town. But while Darius's heart had softened, others' hearts remained hard. That evening, as Tanya was closing up the diner, Reverend Matthews appeared at the counter. "Sister Brooks," he said gravely, "we need to talk." Tanya set down her cleaning supplies. "What about, Reverend?" "About the company you're keeping. About Mac Dalton." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been doing some research. Do you know what that man did in his past? The lives he destroyed?" "I know he's not that person anymore," Tanya said firmly. "His kind doesn't change," the Reverend insisted. "They just get better at hiding who they really are. Think about your children. Think about your reputation in this community." "I am thinking about my children," Tanya replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I'm thinking about showing them that God's grace is real, that people can change when we give them the chance." Several members of the congregation have expressed concern. They're reconsidering their patronage of your establishment. "Then they'll have to reconsider," Tanya said. "I won't turn away someone who's trying to do right just because it makes others uncomfortable." The Reverend shook his head sadly. "I pray you won't regret this decision, Sister Brooks." The next morning proved his words prophetic. The breakfast rush was noticeably thinner. Regular customers who'd been coming in for years suddenly found reasons to eat elsewhere. Mrs. Peterson, who usually ordered a whole pie every Wednesday, called to cancel her standing order. Tanya stood at the register, watching her already fragile finances crumble further. But when she saw Mac and Darius in the parking lot, heads bent together over a motorcycle manual, a strange peace settled over her heart. Some things, she realized, were worth more than money. Some changes were worth any price. She picked up her coffee pot and went to refill the cups of those customers who had stayed, the ones who saw past appearances to the truth of a man's heart. Their small acts of loyalty meant more now than ever before. The wooden pews of First Baptist Church creaked under the weight of curious bodies that Sunday morning. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting colorful shadows across Mac's weathered face as he stood at the pulpit. His hands gripped the wooden edges, knuckles white with tension. "Most of you know me as the biker who's been helping at the Blessing Cup," he began, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "But that ain't the whole truth of who I am, or who I was." Tanya sat in the front row, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected him to actually come when she suggested sharing his testimony. Now, watching him struggle for words, she silently prayed for strength. For both of them. "I spent 15 years with the Hells Angels," Mac continued, his voice growing stronger. "Did things I ain't proud of. Hurt people, sold drugs, collected debts with my fists instead of papers, went to prison for 5 years after a man nearly died from one of those collections." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Peterson clutched, her pearls. Someone near the back stood up and walked out, letting the heavy door slam behind them. "My son Eli," Mac's voice cracked. "He died because of the life I chose. 15 years old, caught in the crossfire of a gang war I helped start. That was 10 years ago, and not a day goes by that I don't see his face." Tears rolled down his cheeks now, but he didn't wipe them away. "I found God in prison, not all at once. Little by little, through the kindness of prison ministers who saw something in me I couldn't see myself. When I got out, I started working with other ex-cons, trying to keep them from falling back in. More people stood to leave. Tanya watched them go, her heart aching. But she also saw others leaning forward, tissues in hand, deeply moved by Mac's raw honesty. "I came to this town by accident," he said. "Bike broke down in the rain. But then Miss Tanya served me coffee with a smile instead of fear. And for the first time in years, I felt human again. Darius, sitting beside his mother, reached for her hand and squeezed it. "I know I don't deserve your trust," Mac concluded. "But I'm standing here because hiding the truth ain't the same as changing. I want to be honest about who I was, so maybe you can see who I'm trying to become." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Matthews stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your candid testimony, Mr. Dalton. Let us pray." But before he could begin, Mrs. Johnson, the choir director, burst into tears. "My Tommy died of an overdose 15 years ago," she sobbed. "Bought his drugs from bikers just like you." She rushed out, followed by several others. Those who remained sat in uncomfortable silence as the service concluded. Afterward, in the parking lot, Tanya approached Mac. "That was brave," she said softly. "Was it stupid?" he asked, looking haunted. "Maybe I should have kept quiet, kept helping quietly instead." "No," she said firmly. "Truth is never wrong. It's just hard sometimes." The next few days brought consequences they hadn't anticipated. Business at the diner dropped sharply. Parents pulled their children away when Mac walked past. The renovation plans he'd drawn for renaming the place Grace Cafe sat untouched on Tanya's desk, a dream that seemed further away with each passing day. Then came Wednesday morning. Tanya was serving breakfast when Sheriff Donnie Kearns's cruiser pulled up outside Mac's workshop. Darius, who had been helping Mac with repairs, came running into the diner moments later. "Mom!" he shouted, panic in his voice. "They're arresting Mac! They say he's got stolen parts!" Tanya rushed outside, leaving the griddle burning. By the time she reached the workshop, Mac was already in handcuffs. Tools and motorcycle parts lay scattered across the ground where deputies had dumped them from boxes. "Serial numbers match parts stolen from dealers across 3 states, Sheriff Kearns announced, looking grimly satisfied. "Should have known better than to trust a Hell's Angel." "That's not true!" Darius yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mac didn't steal anything. He helps people." "Son, step back," the sheriff warned. "This man isn't who you think he is." "You're wrong!" Darius lunged forward, but Tanya caught him, holding him back as tears streamed down his face. "He's changed. He's good now." Mac stood quietly, his eyes meeting Tanya's. "I didn't do this," he said softly, "but I understand if you can't believe that." As they led him to the cruiser, Tanya noticed something odd. Some of the parts looked too new, too clean compared to Mac's usual salvage work. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. But the damage was done. By afternoon, the story was all over town. The diner sat empty except for Tanya and her children. Even the veterans who'd become regulars stayed away. The phone rang occasionally, not with orders, but with people calling to say they wouldn't be coming anymore. That evening, after closing early, Tanya sat alone in her dark diner. She pulled out the renovation plans Mac had drawn. His neat handwriting marked measurements and materials with little notes in the margins. "Kids' corner here," and "extra counter space for pie display." She traced the words Grace Cafe with her finger, remembering how his eyes had lit up when he'd shown her the designs. "A place where everybody gets a second chance," he'd said, "just like you gave me." The tears she'd been holding back all day finally came. She slid from her chair to her knees, still clutching the papers. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't understand. Everything was going so well. People were starting to see past their judgments. Mac was doing so much good. I can't see your plan in any of this." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "But I remember what you did for me when James died, how you carried me through that darkness. So I'll wait. I'll trust, even if I can't see the way forward." The diner's old clock ticked steadily in the darkness. Outside, crickets chirped their evening song, and somewhere in the county jail, a man who'd tried to change sat in a cell, wondering if anyone still believed in second chances. Tanya stayed on her knees, praying in the dark, until the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. She might not understand God's plan, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't giving up on Mac. Not when he'd finally started believing in himself. The October days grew shorter and colder. Leaves scattered across the Blessing Cup's empty parking lot as Tanya worked alone, serving the few customers who still came. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, she'd lock up early and drive to the county jail, hope heavy in her heart. The visiting room was always the same. Cold metal chairs, thick glass between them, and Mac on the other side, looking more defeated each time. His usually straight shoulders now slumped. The proud man, who'd fixed her fence, now couldn't meet her eyes. "The lawyer says they might reduce the charges if you cooperate," Tanya said on her 5th visit, pressing her hand against the glass. "Please, Mac, talk to me." He shook his head, his voice rough from disuse. "Maybe this is what I deserve. For everything before." "That's not true," she insisted. "God doesn't work like that." "Sometimes he does." Mac's eyes were distant. "Sometimes the bill comes due." No matter what she said, he remained silent, accepting his punishment like a man who believed he had it coming. After 2 weeks of visits, Tanya drove home, crying, her faith tested but not broken. Meanwhile, Darius spent every free moment at Mac's workshop. The police had sealed it off with yellow tape, but they'd missed the small back window. Darius slipped in after school, determined to prove Mac's innocence. "There's got to be something," he muttered, shuffling through old receipts and repair manuals. "Mac wouldn't steal. He wouldn't lie to us." On his 4th day of searching, Darius noticed something odd about the workbench's bottom drawer. It didn't slide all the way back. Reaching deep inside, his fingers found a loose panel. Behind it lay a dusty envelope addressed to Pastor Michael Reynolds, Second Chance Ministries. With trembling hands, Darius opened it. Inside were photographs. Mac with other bikers, some wearing Hell's Angels patches. But these weren't trophy shots. They showed illegal parts being moved, drugs being exchanged. Each photo had dates and locations written on the back in Mac's neat handwriting. There were letters too, dozens of them. Darius read the first one, dated 6 months ago. "Pastor Mike, another shipment came through last night. Same route, same players. I've documented everything like we discussed. It's killing me to watch and not stop them. But you're right. We need the whole network. 3 more kids overdosed last week. I won't let Eli's death be for nothing. Keep praying for me." Darius's heart pounded. He stuffed everything back in the envelope and ran all the way home, ignoring the strange looks from people on the street. "Mom!" he burst into the diner, out of breath. "Look what I found!" Tanya read through the letters with shaking hands. Each one detailed Mac's undercover work, helping a ministry track illegal trafficking through his old gang connections. The final letter was dated just days before his arrest. "This is why they planted those parts," she whispered. "They knew he was gathering evidence." She drove straight to the sheriff's office, Darius beside her clutching the envelope. Sheriff Kearns wasn't happy to see them, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. "These dates match our records of suspicious activity," he admitted grudgingly, spreading the photos across his desk. "And these names, we've been watching these guys for months." "Then you know Mac's innocent," Tanya pressed. "He was helping stop them, not working with them." The sheriff frowned. "It's not that simple. He's still associated with known criminals." "To save lives," Darius interrupted. "Like my friend Tommy's brother who nearly died from their drugs. Mac was trying to stop that." A knock at the door made them all turn. Pastor Whitlow stood there, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, "and I believe I can verify some of this. Pastor Reynolds called me last month asking about Mac. Said he was doing God's work in a dark place." The pastor stepped forward, laying a hand on the sheriff's desk. "Donnie, we were wrong about him. I was wrong. Sometimes God's servants look different than we expect." Sheriff Kearns studied the evidence for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "I'll make some calls. But this needs to be handled carefully. Those gang members are still out there." Word spread through town like a revival testimony. The diner's phone started ringing again, not with criticism this time, but with support. People who'd turned away now came back, bringing casseroles and apologies. "Did you hear about Mac?" they'd whisper. "Working undercover all this time?" "Remember how quick we were to judge?" others would reply. "Just like those Pharisees Jesus warned about." The preacher's wife, who'd stopped coming in months ago, now sat at the counter every morning. "We were so focused on his past," she told Tanya. "We couldn't see God working in his present." Even Tommy's mother, who'd been one of the loudest critics, came to apologize. "My boy might be alive today because of what Mac was doing," she said through tears. "I judged him so harshly, but he was fighting for our children all along." Tanya listened to it all with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. The truth had come out, but Mac was still sitting in that cell, believing he deserved to be there. Each night, she prayed for his spirit to heal along with his name. The following Sunday, Pastor Whitlow devoted his entire sermon to judgment and redemption. "We saw a man's leather vest," he proclaimed, "but God saw his heart. We counted his tattoos while God counted his tears. Who are we to say where grace can't reach?" After the service, a group gathered to plan Mac's legal defense. The same townspeople who'd shunned him now wrote letters to the judge, describing how he'd helped their community. Veterans told stories of late-night counseling sessions in the diner. Parents shared how he'd steered their teenagers away from trouble. "Maybe this is what God meant all along," Tanya told Darius, as they watched people fill the blessing cup again. "Sometimes it takes a fall for everyone to see the truth." Her son nodded, polishing the counter like his father used to do. "When Mac gets out," he said quietly, "can we still rename it Grace Cafe?" Tanya smiled, touching the cross necklace James had given her years ago. "I think that's exactly what it should be called." The next morning, Sheriff Kearns called a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. His usually stern face looked softer, almost apologetic. "After reviewing substantial evidence and working with federal authorities, all charges against Mac Dalton have been dropped," he announced, adjusting his badge. Mr. Dalton was, in fact, working to help shut down illegal activities in our community. We owe him an apology. The news spread faster than summer wildfire. By noon, the blessing cup was overflowing with people bringing casseroles, flowers, and envelopes stuffed with cash. Veterans lined up to share stories about how Mac had helped them through dark nights. Widows brought fresh-baked pies, remembering how he'd fixed their porches or changed their tires. At Jefferson High School, Darius stood before his entire class, hands steady on the podium. "Everyone thought they knew what strength was," he began. "They thought it meant being tough, being feared. But real strength, that's what Mac showed us. It's fixing what's broken. It's helping when nobody's watching. It's standing up for what's right, even when the whole world thinks you're wrong." The gymnasium fell silent. Then, one by one, students stood up, clapping until the sound echoed off the walls. 3 days later, a borrowed blue pickup truck rumbled down Main Street. Mac sat behind the wheel, his weathered hands gripping tight. As he turned toward the blessing cup, his breath caught in his throat. The entire town seemed to be there, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the diner. Signs read, "Welcome home, and God's grace wins." Tanya stepped forward from the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. Mac lowered his head, overwhelmed by the sight. The same people who'd once crossed the street to avoid him now stood applauding, their faces bright with understanding and acceptance. The transformation of the Blessing Cup took 3 weeks of dedicated work. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and a brand new sign gleamed above the entrance: Grace's Road Cafe. The name change felt right to everyone, a perfect blend of faith and second chances. On reopening day, the parking lot overflowed with cars and motorcycles. Local news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing the remarkable story of redemption. Veterans in pressed uniforms stood beside church ladies in flowered dresses, all waiting for the doors to open. Tanya emerged wearing her best Sunday dress, a blue floral print that matched the summer sky. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we celebrate more than just a cafe," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We celebrate a community that chose compassion over comfort, understanding over judgment. You all taught me that grace isn't just something we receive, it's something we give." Inside, Mac worked the griddle like a master, his weathered hands expertly flipping pancakes as steam rose around him. "Never thought I'd be cooking for this many angels," he called out with a grin, making everyone laugh. The preacher stepped forward for the blessing, his earlier doubts replaced with humble wisdom. "Sometimes," he proclaimed, "God sends grace in leather and steel. His messengers don't always wear wings." As evening settled in, Tanya, Mac, and the kids gathered on the front steps. The new neon sign cast a warm glow over them all. Darius reached into his backpack and pulled out Mac's old motorcycle helmet, now gleaming with fresh polish. On its side, carefully painted letters read, "Forgiven roads still lead home." Mac took the helmet with trembling hands, tears welling in his eyes as he traced the words with his fingers. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message said everything. The seasons changed, painting Grace's Road Cafe in autumn colors before winter's first frost appeared. Business stayed steady through it all. Every morning, regulars filed in for their usual orders, greeting Mac and Tanya like old friends. Veterans gathered for coffee and conversation, while truckers spread the word about the little cafe, where everyone got a fair chance. Tanya and Mac fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side. Their partnership deepened beyond the daily tasks of running the cafe. They shared quiet moments of prayer before opening, celebrated small victories, and faced challenges together with unwavering faith. On Christmas Eve, soft snowflakes drifted down like tiny stars against the darkening sky. The cafe windows glowed warm and inviting, decorated with paper snowflakes Lena had cut out. As closing time approached, Mac carefully hung a wooden angel above the entrance, Lena's latest creation, carved with surprising skill for a 9-year-old. Outside, laughter filled the crisp air as Darius pulled his sister on their old red sled. Lena's pink hat bobbed up and down as she squealed with delight, while Darius grinned, his earlier teenage skepticism replaced by genuine joy. Tanya finished wiping down the last table and joined Mac at the window. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play in the fresh snow. The cafe's neon sign cast a warm glow across the white ground, making the scene look almost magical. "Guess you found your road," Tanya whispered, her voice soft with emotion. Mac turned to her, his eyes reflecting all the peace he'd finally found. "No," he replied gently. "We found it." Beyond them, the illuminated sign of Grace's Road Cafe shone bright against the snowy night, a beacon of hope and unity in a town that had learned to see past differences and embrace second chances. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.